The screen is pitch black. A heavy, rhythmic clock ticks in the background, accompanied by the distant, muffled boom of naval artillery. A sharp, warm light suddenly cuts through the darkness, illuminating a massive, weathered map of the South Pacific laid out on a wooden table. A pair of hands enters the frame, holding a simple pair of brass dividers. The camera slowly moves up to reveal a speaker standing over the map. The tone is deliberate, gripping, and deeply authoritative. In the brutal ledger of World War II, victory was almost always bought with blood. Across the frozen fields of Europe and the scorched deserts of North Africa, the formula was simple. Look for the enemy's strongest fortress, mass your men, and smash through it, no matter the cost. But in the vast, unforgiving expanses of the Pacific Ocean, one American general realized that fighting the war by the old rules would lead to a slaughter that the Allied forces could not afford. His name was General Douglas MacArthur, and his ultimate test was a place the Japanese called the impregnable fortress Rabaul. By 1943, Rabaul, situated on the northeastern tip of New Britain Island, was a dagger pointed directly at the throat of Australia. It wasn't just a military base. It was a sprawling, subterranean labyrinth defended by over 100,000 fanatical Japanese imperial troops. It boasted 5 massive airfields, a deep-water harbor that could shield an entire battle fleet, and hundreds of concrete bunkers carved deep into volcanic rock. For the Allies to take Rabaul by direct amphibious assault would require a bloody campaign that planners estimated would cost over 100,000 Allied lives and take years to complete. It would have been the Verdun of the Pacific. But MacArthur chose a different path. Instead of launching a frontal assault into the jaws of the dragon, he decided to cut off its air supply, blind its eyes, and let it starve in isolation. This is the untold story of Operation Cartwheel, a masterclass in operational design that proved you don't have to destroy an army on the battlefield if you can completely erase its strategic relevance. That the camera zooms into the map, focusing on the Bismarck archipelago. Red lines represent Japanese supply routes flowing from Tokyo down to Rabaul, while blue arrows begin to curve upward from Australia and Guadalcanal like a giant pair of jaws to understand the genius of what MacArthur called leapfrogging, or island hopping. You have to understand the sheer psychological terror Rabaul inflicted on Allied planners in early 1943. Under the command of General Hitoshi Imamura, the Japanese 8th Area Army had turned this tropical paradise into an inescapable death trap. They had spent over a year digging miles of interconnected tunnels beneath the volcanic ridges. Artillery pieces were hidden behind retractable steel doors inside caves, capable of firing upon the beaches and then vanishing into the earth. The harbor was packed with warships, and the skies above were patrolled by hundreds of Japan's elite naval aviators. If MacArthur followed standard military doctrine, he would have gathered every available division, loaded them into landing craft, and sent them storming onto those heavily fortified beaches. But MacArthur, working alongside Admiral William Bull Halsey, recognized a fatal flaw in the Japanese Empire's island empire. It was entirely dependent on the sea. An island fortress is only as strong as the ships that can supply it and the planes that can protect it. If you strip away its ships and its planes, that fortress doesn't protect an empire anymore. it becomes an isolated, self-contained prison camp. This realization gave birth to Operation Cartwheel. Launched in June 1943, the strategy was modeled after a wagon wheel. Rabaul was the hub at the center. The spokes were the surrounding islands held by smaller Japanese garrisons. MacArthur's plan was not to strike the hub, but to systematically break the spokes one by one, moving his forces into the gaps to build his own airfields. Once those airfields were built, Allied bombers could reach out and choke the hub from a distance. The visual on the map transitions to a synchronized animation. Two distinct blue lines begin to advance simultaneously. One line pushes through the dense jungles of New Guinea. The other jumps across the stepping stones of the Solomon Islands. This was a dual-axis strategy executed with absolute mathematical precision. In the South Pacific Theater, Admiral Halsey's forces began climbing the ladder of the Solomons, launching a brutal assault on New Georgia to seize the airfield at Munda. Meanwhile, in the Southwest Pacific, MacArthur's Australian and American troops advanced along the rugged, malaria-ridden northern coast of New Guinea, capturing La and Salamoa. The Japanese command in Rabaul watched these advances and fell directly into MacArthur's trap. Believing that these Allied landings were the preparatory steps for a final, massive assault on Rabaul itself, General Imamura began bleeding his garrison dry. He shipped thousands of reinforcement troops, tons of ammunition, and hundreds of precious aircraft down the spokes of the wheel to defend places like New Georgia and Bougainville. But MacArthur had no intention of fighting for every piece of coral. In August 1943, at the Quadrant Conference in Quebec, MacArthur and the Joint Chiefs made the official, historic decision. Rabaul would be bypassed completely. They would hit them where they ain't, seizing the lightly defended islands that lay just outside Rabaul's defensive umbrella, establishing their own radar stations and fighter bases, and completely ignoring the main Japanese stronghold. The screen darkens. A low, ominous bass drone fills the audio track, and the screen transitions back to the speaker as he steps closer to the map, his face etched with grim intensity. He points the brass dividers directly at a small island group just northwest of Rabaul, the Admiralty Islands. By late 1943, the giant jaws of Operation Cartwheel were ready to snap shut. The outer ring of the Japanese defense had been cracked, and now MacArthur was ready to deliver the strategic coup de grace. The encirclement of Rabaul wasn't completed with infantry bayonets. It was executed through the absolute devastation of the air and sea lanes surrounding the island of New Britain. The turning point came in November 1943, when Halsey's forces bypassed heavily fortified Japanese positions and landed on Bougainville, just 210 miles from Rabaul. The primary objective wasn't to conquer the whole island, but to quickly carve out a secure perimeter and construct a massive airfield complex. Within weeks, Allied engineers had built runways right out of the swamp. For the first time in the war, American fighter escorts could accompany heavy bombers all the way to Rabaul and stay over the target long enough to engage the Japanese defenders in sustained dogfights. What followed was one of the most relentless, crushing air campaigns in human history. Day after day, waves of B-25 Mitchells, B-24 Liberators, and Marine Corsair fighters roared over Rabaul's harbor. They didn't just bomb the airfields. They hunted the Japanese aircraft in the sky, Admiral Yamamoto, and later his successor, Admiral Koga, committed the absolute cream of Japan's naval air arm to the defense of Rabaul. It was a catastrophic mistake. In the skies over New Britain, the remnants of the veteran pilots who had struck Pearl Harbor were systematically wiped out. By February 1944, the skies over Rabaul went completely silent. The Japanese had no planes left to launch. With the air arm shattered, MacArthur moved to seal the sea lanes. In late February 1944, in a characteristically bold and risky move, MacArthur ordered the 1st Cavalry Division to seize the Admiralty Islands, specifically Lost, Negros, and Manus. The camera tracks a blue arrow slicing deep behind Rabaul, cutting off its connection to the home islands of Japan. This move was the final nail in the coffin. By seizing the Admiralties and Imiro Island, MacArthur had completely cut off Rabaul from its main supply line to the great Japanese naval base at Truk. The encirclement was total. The fortress at Rabaul, with its 100,000 defenders, its miles of tunnels, and its deadly hidden artillery, was now completely isolated from the rest of the world. The strategic transformation was absolute. Those 100,000 imperial soldiers were no longer a formidable vanguard threatening Australia and protecting the southern flank of the Japanese Empire. Instead, they were converted overnight into the world's most heavily armed, self-avowed prisoners of war. They had plenty of rifles and millions of rounds of ammunition, but they had no ships to transport them, no planes to protect them, and no food arriving from Japan. To survive, the proud soldiers of the Emperor had to lay down their weapons, clear patches of the jungle, and spend the remainder of the war planting sweet potatoes just to keep from starving to death. MacArthur's island-hopping strategy achieved something that many traditional military minds thought impossible. He neutralized the most powerful enemy base in the Southwest Pacific without ever sending a single soldier to storm its main defensive lines. By sacrificing relatively few men on peripheral islands, he saved countless lives on both sides and left a massive enemy force entirely stranded, watching helplessly from their volcanic ridges as the American war machine bypassed them completely and accelerated its march toward the Philippines and Tokyo. The speaker slowly closes the brass dividers, places them down on the map over the now faded red circle of Rabaul, and looks directly into the lens. History remembers the great battles of attrition, the grand charges, and the costly beach landings. But the neutralization of Rabaul stands as a monument to a much rarer form of military brilliance, the victory of pure maneuver. It proved forever that in the theater of war, the most elegant way to defeat an immovable fortress is to simply make it irrelevant. The lights in the war room slowly fade to black. The heavy ticking of the clock stops. The darkness lifts slightly, revealing a different angle of the map table, littered with aerial reconnaissance photographs, tactical reports, and grease pencils. The speaker returns, the weight of the campaign, apparent in his delivery as the focus, shifts to the intricate operational mechanics that made this psychological encirclement possible. To truly grasp how MacArthur managed to strangle a massive garrison without ever trading blows with it, we must examine the sheer mechanical precision of the logistical warfare being played out in the dark corners of the Pacific. While the public saw headlines of infantry charges, MacArthur's staff was playing a game of geographic checkmate. The Japanese leadership at Rabaul, led by General Imamura and Admiral Kusaka, operated on an archaic martial doctrine that assumed an enemy would always seek to engage their main force. They believed that the Bushido spirit, combined with steel-reinforced volcanic caves, would act as a meat grinder for Allied forces. They wanted the battle. They expected the Americans to land in Simpson Harbor and die by the tens of thousands on the dark sands of New Britain. But MacArthur understood that an army is not just made of men and weapons. It is an organic machine that requires a constant intake of fuel, medicine, rice, and spare parts. Without these, a soldier is merely a man waiting to die in a uniform. By mid-1943, the Allied Southwest Pacific Area Command had mastered the art of amphibious warfare. But more importantly, they had mastered the art of short-range airfield construction. The secret weapon of the island-hopping campaign was not the tank or the battleship. It was the United States Navy Seabees and the Army Engineer Aviation Battalions. These men could land on a swampy, malaria-infested island, clear miles of dense jungle with bulldozers, lay down steel Marston matting, and have a fully operational fighter strip running in less than 2 weeks. This engineering capability changed the mathematics of distance in the Pacific. Every time MacArthur moved 70 miles forward, he brought his land-based air power 70 miles closer to the enemy's throat. The camera pans across the map to the northern coast of New Guinea, tracing a line from Buna to Huon Peninsula. Consider the operation at Woodlock and Kirawina Islands in June 1943. These islands were virtually undefended by the Japanese, who viewed them as strategically insignificant because they lacked existing infrastructure. MacArthur saw them differently. He saw them as flat platforms for unsinkable aircraft carriers. Allied forces landed without a single casualty, and within 30 days, American aircraft were flying patrols from these positions, cutting off the southern escape routes from Rabaul. The Japanese in Rabaul were left holding a massive shield, but the blows were landing behind them, around them, and above them. It was a cognitive dissonance that the Imperial High Command could not resolve. They kept expecting the heavy hammer blow to their center. So they kept their finest divisions held in reserve, waiting for a landing that would never come, while their peripheral outposts were picked off like pieces on a chessboard as the perimeter contracted. The logistical strangulation intensified. The Japanese required hundreds of tons of supplies daily to maintain the operational readiness of Rabaul's 5 airfields and its massive naval facilities. When the Allied air forces secured air superiority over the Solomon Sea, the traditional Japanese transport ships, the slow and vulnerable Maru vessels, could no longer risk the journey from Truk or Manila. The Imperial Japanese Navy was forced to rely on the Tokyo Express, utilizing fast destroyers at night to drop supplies off in floating rubber drums. But a destroyer cannot carry heavy artillery. It cannot carry thousands of tons of rice, and it cannot carry the fuel required to keep an air fleet airborne. Soon, even the destroyers became too expensive to lose. The Japanese were reduced to using submarines to bring in meager rations of rice, a method that was akin to feeding an elephant with a teaspoon. The speaker picks up an aerial photograph showing the scorched earth of Simpson Harbor, littered with the hulls of sunken merchant vessels. The psychological impact on the Japanese garrison was profound. They were not cowards. They were highly trained, battle-hardened professionals who were prepared to fight to the last man. Yet, day after day, they watched the horizon, hoping to see the Imperial Japanese Navy arrive with reinforcements, only to see the smoke of their own sinking supply ships on the distant water. They were left with nothing to do but watch American forces fly over their heads to strike other targets. MacArthur had realized that an army trapped in a cave is an army that cannot affect the outcome of the war. By leaving them there, he turned 100,000 of Japan's best troops into an administrative burden for Tokyo, an army that was alive but strategically dead. This operational philosophy was an inversion of traditional Western military thought, which, since the time of Clausewitz, had dictated that the destruction of the enemy's main battle force was the primary objective of any campaign. MacArthur, often criticized for his ego and his theatricality, showed an extraordinary level of restraint and intellectual flexibility in this instance. He recognized that the geography of the Pacific allowed for a new kind of warfare, where space could be used as a weapon. By controlling the air and the sea, he transformed the vastness of the ocean from an obstacle into a barrier that kept his enemies locked inside their own fortresses. The visual focus shifts back to the map as the blue arrows converge from the admiralties, completing the circle. The final phase of this operational masterpiece occurred in the early months of 1944, with the Admiralty Islands in Allied hands. The construction of the massive naval and air base at Seidler Harbor began. This base was larger than Pearl Harbor, capable of holding up to 300 warships. From this forward position, the Allies could project power deep into the Central Pacific, completely bypassing Rabaul and rendering it a backwater theater. The outer crust of the Japanese defensive perimeter had not just been broken, it had been completely re-engineered to serve the Allied advance. The very islands that Tokyo had seized at the start of the war to protect their empire were now being used as the launching pads for their destruction. As the main body of the American war machine moved toward the Philippines, a small force of Australian troops was left behind to contain the Rabaul garrison. The Australians did not launch massive assaults. They maintained a strict blockade, conducting aggressive patrolling to ensure the Japanese remained confined to their defensive perimeters. The war moved on thousands of miles to the north and west, leaving Rabaul behind like a ship marooned on a drying reef. The speaker stands straight, looking directly at the camera, the map behind him fading into shadow. When the war finally ended, in August 1945, General Imamura surrendered his sword to the Allies on the deck of a British warship. When the Allied officers walked through the underground tunnels of Rabaul, they were stunned by what they found. They found an army that was physically intact, with millions of rounds of ammunition, thousands of operational rifles, and defensive positions that could have withstood months of heavy bombardment. But they also found an army that had spent the last 18 months doing nothing but farming to survive, completely cut off from the empire they had sworn to protect. MacArthur's strategy had succeeded flawlessly. He had defeated 100,000 men without fighting them, proving that the ultimate expression of military strategy is to win not through the destruction of your enemy's body, but through the total neutralization of his ability to act. The screen goes completely dark, leaving only the faint, echoing sound of a distant ocean wave crashing against an isolated shore before fading into absolute silence.